Thank you, Mrs. Lane. Next up is communication. We have no one has signed up to speak tonight, so we move on to superintendent's recommendations and reports.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Begley. At this time, I would like to ask Mrs. Hauer, to cover the items listed under personnel professional and personnel support.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
You're
Mr.
welcome.
Mr. Begley, members of the board, I have several items for your consideration this evening under personnel professional. Number 1, resignation, letter A, and number 2, employment, letters A and B. And that concludes all the items I have for your consideration tonight under personnel professional.
Thank you, Mrs. Hauer. Ask for a motion to accept the recommendations as read.
So moved. Second.
Mrs. Birding Miller and Mrs. Shorter. Mrs. Lane, please call the roll.
Mrs. Birding Miller,
Yes.
Mrs. Shorter,
Yes.
Mr. Begley.
Yes.
Mr. Begley, members of the board, I have several items for your consideration this evening under personnel support. Number 1, resignations, letters A through F. Number 2, employment, letters A through D. And number 3, correction, letter A. And number 4, promotion, letter A. And that concludes all the items I have for your consideration this evening under personnel support.
Thank you. I'll entertain a motion to accept these recommendations.
So moved.
Second.
Mrs. Shorter and Mrs. Birding Miller. Mrs. Lane, call the roll.
Mrs. Shorter,
Yes.
Mrs. Birding Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Begley.
Yes.